Good afternoon, hello, and welcome. My name is Tamsin Rose, and I am the Senior Fellow for Health at Friends of Europe and the Africa Europe Foundation. Welcome to this event looking at how we build resilience, how to do better for Europe and the world dealing with a future pandemic. This is part of a series of talks for the EU40, which is the network of MEPs in the European Parliament under 40. Let me just give you a little bit about the housekeeping and how this afternoon will run. This event is broadcast on LinkedIn and YouTube. It will be available on the platform of the EU40 in the future for those who would want to watch it or share it again. If you'd like to engage with us and keep the conversation going, you can see here on the screen the hashtag is EU40Talks. Participants who registered in advance and who are watching us through the platform are able to engage with us, and you can submit questions using the Q&A form. And you'll be able to see that, and your questions will be submitted anonymously. And during this afternoon, when we have panels of speakers, I will be using your questions to ask information from our speakers. You can learn more about the organizations where our speakers are based by looking at the bottom of your screen on the right-hand side. If you're on our registered platform, you'll see there's an expo. If you click on that link, you'll be able to go and find out more about the organizations where they're based. We will also be asking you to interact with you, and I will be asking you in a few moments to open a poll, and you're going to need to use the tasks button that you see on the right-hand side of the menu. Now, how this is going to work is we have two panels of different experts this afternoon, and for each panel, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions to those speakers. And you'll find all of that on the right-hand side of the menu, and you'll be able to click on Q&A, and there you can submit a question, and you can also find out more about the background of each of the speakers by clicking on their names. We are being hosted by an MEP, Nikolai Stefanuta from the European Parliament, who will be joining us shortly. But before we do that, I'd like to ask you a question. This whole session is going to be about how we learn the lessons of the last 2 years and move forward. And I remind you that the pandemic is far from over. In the past 2 years, more than 250 million people have caught COVID. We've had more than 5 million deaths globally. There were 3 million new cases last week, and the number of cases continues to increase. And Europe is once again the epicenter of the global epidemic. So even though it feels like it's been a very long time and we've had relatively high levels of vaccination in Europe, the situation is not over. So this afternoon, we're going to be exploring what have we learned about how to respond and how to manage better, and what lessons can we learn from the last 2 years to make sure we're stronger in Europe in terms of our response and as part of a global connection, because the one thing we know is that viruses don't need passports to cross borders. So Europe needs to be a strong part of a global response and preparedness for a future health threat such as a pandemic. So we've launched the poll now. Could you please click on the tasks? And we're asking you a very simple question. As we mark in December 2 years of this pandemic, have we learned the right lessons? Is the world better prepared now to respond to the challenges of this and future pandemics? And we're giving you 3 options with the response. You can say yes, you think that we are better prepared to deal with this and future threats. You can say no, you don't think we're better prepared. Or the third option is partly, if you feel we've made some progress, but there are still things that we can do. And I want to get a sense from you how you're feeling about the response of the past 2 years. How much have we understood and put in place the mechanisms that we need to respond? And in a few moments, we're going to be sharing the results of that poll. But while we're waiting for that, let me introduce to you the members of our first panel. And this first section is going to be looking at taking stock of the lessons learned from the pandemic. And we have Nicolae Stefanutu, a member of the European Parliament from Romania. He's from the Renew Europe group. We have Antonella Cardone, who's the Executive Director of the European Cancer Patients Coalition. We have Sir Peter Horby, who is the Professor of Emerging Infectious Diseases and Global Health at the University of Oxford. And we have Rick Suarez, who's the Country President for Spain for AstraZeneca. And they'll be helping us to explore all of these issues. But before we do that, can we please see the results of the poll? We asked you How ready are we? Have we learned the lessons? And here we can see that some people have said yes. More people have said no, we're not ready. But the vast majority of people have come in and said, well, yeah, we're partly ready. We've made some progress. And of course, in the past 2 years, at an unprecedented speed, we have identified the pathogen. We've learned more about how it attacks the body. We have a range of vaccines that have been both tested, approved, and rolled out. We have new therapeutics coming online. And this has never been done before. All of this has happened in the past 2 years. So it's certainly true that we are better in our understanding and knowledge, but there's so much more we can do. And I can see here that our answers are still changing. People are saying, yeah, partly, still we've got a lot of responses saying no. And I'm going to ask our panel to speak to that. So let me start by asking the first question. And as a reminder to you in the audience, if you have a question for our panel, please use the Q&A function that you'll find next to the information about the panel on the right-hand side. So the first thing I'd like to ask is if I can have my panel members. The perspective, let's start now with the perspective from the European Parliament. Do I have MEP Nikolai Stefanuto here? Yes, excellent. Could I please invite you to give a few words of welcome? And then I'm going to ask you the view from the Parliament. Go ahead, the floor is yours.
Certainly. And thank you for your brilliant presentation. And it was super interesting to see that 4 out of 10 people said we're still not ready, whereas 6 said we are or we're partly ready. To be honest, I think we're pretty much ready because a pandemic is something of a momentous size. It's not just a normal event. And I believe that what Europe has gone through is a very good dress rehearsal. I know that that sounds perhaps very crazy to say, but it might be a dress rehearsal for something even worse, for a climatic event, for another pandemic, for war. And I don't mean to throw these words out just to scare you more. I see that 4 out of you are still very skeptical, and this is in the Euro bubble, because I'm guessing most of you who are watching are in some way connected. So I wonder what the numbers are for the real population. I prepared some introductory remarks, if you allow me. I am a bit tired. I just came from budget negotiations. We finished at 1 a.m. in the council building last night. But I came not with empty hands from there. And one of my biggest achievements, one of our biggest achievements as a group, Renew, was to get more money for health, for EU for health, and for international vaccines. We managed to get a pretty staggering 125 million extra on top of 1.3 billion that the Commission put together for the vaccines, and another 125 million for EU for health. So when I was there in the council building, I was thinking, what do people outside, what would they like to see from something as technical and as bizarre as the European process for negotiating the budget? And I was thinking, if I were a young person out there watching, I would look for keywords in a way, no? I would look to see, is the environment there? Is the climate there? Is health there? Is something that I care truly about there? Is Erasmus there? Or am I going to be able to travel again? Will there be European support? So that was my motivating factor, and I think it was a very, very good thing to have in mind. That's why I really appreciated your on-the-spot survey there. I think it was very useful to see where we are and where we stand. The pandemic has not just been a pandemic of COVID. It has also been a pandemic of disinformation, of fake news. So I think we are far from calculating the disastrous effects of this pandemic. I think we're just beginning to understand them. Having said that, I wonder how the continuous evolution of the pandemic, and also some decisions we might have to take. For instance, will there be more youth vaccinated? Will our children be vaccinated? Will there be perhaps medicines to replace vaccines, etc.? What will they bring down the line? And also, I have a question for you. Do you think the youth is prepared to go through this? And I wonder if anybody surveyed the opinions, the understanding of the youth for vaccines, for the pandemic, for restrictions, for the certificate. I'm really wondering if this category of generation, this is an event, after all, organized by EU40, what their level of knowledge is, what their understanding is, and I wonder how permeated this category is also by fake news and disinformation. It's just something that I was thinking from the top of my head. Secondly, uh, the virus made us more united. I know that initially we suffered. Initially, we were all on our own. We were egoistic. We closed borders. We couldn't help Italy. We couldn't help Belgium in the initial phases. But now all these things have changed. All these things have changed. The European Union, who was kept out of the crisis of the health sector for so long, managed now to have a EU for Health program, a dedicated program that's just, it's significant. You know, it's 5.1 billion. It's going to be even more with our help. Not only that, but it has other instruments. It has UCPM, the Civil Protection Mechanism. It has the Solidarity Fund. It has the European Early Warning Rescue System, where we can see if there's a need in Romania, where I come from. We can look outside in the European Union and see if that need can be met by another hospital, by another country, etc. So all of these are not nothing, you know. Those usually would have taken decades to achieve. We have an HERA agency. We have a stronger ECDC. We have all these things that are built in the space of 1 year. We have the vaccine, for God's sake, which without the support of public money of the European Union could not have been developed so quickly and also dispersed so easily among the member states. Let's not forget, and I'll probably finish with this, that solidarity was shown throughout. Do you remember when we were in January and we were thinking that maybe not everyone will have the vaccine? And what if, let's say, a poorer EU country like Romania would get only a certain number of vaccines, or not exactly the same type of vaccines as everyone else? You know, the fact that we all got them together, that we all purchased them together, that a Frenchman and a Romanian could have access to exactly the same vaccines, I think is a great show of solidarity. And if you talk to anybody who's outside the union, they look at us with admiringly. They think it would be great if I were a citizen of the European Union to have the vaccine, to have all these possibilities, to have the European Union take care of me if I need it. So these were my initial thoughts. It's always a pleasure to be with EU40, an organization I support completely as a board member and as a sympathizer also.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Nikolai. Let me now bring in Antonella to give us also a perspective from the ground, because, of course, cancer patients, along with many other patients suffering from different conditions, had their healthcare experience heavily disrupted. So, Antonella, what has been the impact of the pandemic, particularly from your perspective, on cancer patients?
Well, thank you, Tamsin, and thank you to you for 40 for inviting me here to contribute to the discussion and bring in the patient voice. So, as I said, COVID-19 has been disruptive for all health systems in the world, but it has had a huge toll on cancer patients, and with approximately 40% drop in diagnosis of cancer in 2020, the pandemic will negatively affect cancer outcomes in the near future even more. With the screening and follow-up consultations suspended for a period of time, there will be a spike in the number of fatalities in newly diagnosed cancer patients due to late diagnosis or treatment during the pandemic. So we have experienced that during the pandemic, patients with a chronic condition, including cancer, were reluctant to go to their GP and be referred to the hospital because they feared to catch the virus more than the potential tumors. In some cases, cancer patients delayed consulting their doctors because they did not want to add to the burden of the health system. Then also the the health systems had to face some challenges. Hospitals were delaying some services, including surgeries that were considered not life-threatening or urgent. And these decisions were made mainly because of the lack of hospitalization beds and respirators in the operating rooms that were transferred to the intensive care units. So as a consequence, this led to the cancellation of numerous medical checks and follow-ups. In many cases, there was a temporary suspension of clinical trials due to restricted access to clinics and hospitals, and also to the fact that healthcare professionals were committed to COVID-19 related tasks. And this was critical as these trials often represent an important line of treatment, if not the only chance to survive for cancer patients. So, as said, the toll paid by patients was huge and still remains high until everyone is vaccinated, I could say. There are still too many beds and places in the ICU occupied by Novax, causing the suspension of surgery and treatments for cancer patients. And this is really unbearable at this stage. Maybe it's time to set up a cost action against people refusing the vaccine.
Thank you very much, Antonella, and again for just reminding us the impact on people who are trying to access care for a number of different reasons, and the impact on not feeling safe going to hospitals and elsewhere, and just what the impact that has on their everyday life. Nikolai mentioned just how extraordinary the last 2 years have been in terms of an effort, and how everyone had to pull together and put their assets and their knowledge and expertise so that we are 2 years later in this extraordinary position where we have a number of different vaccines, we have therapeutics, things have been rolled out. But let's try and understand how we got here. Let me invite Sir Peter Horby from the University of Oxford. What does it take to identify and manufacture a new vaccine at unprecedented speed and scale? Just give us a sense of what life has been like for your team, and how this has involved an enormous effort.
Thanks, Tamsin. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, sorry. I'm actually the co-lead of the recovery trial, which is a trial of treatments, although my colleagues here in Oxford developed the AstraZeneca, or developed the Chadox vaccine with AstraZeneca. And the recovery trial, has now identified 3 treatments that work for COVID-19. Looking at the plus side, it's been unprecedented what's been achieved. If we look at the usual timeframes for getting phase 3 trials completed for drugs and vaccines, and then getting approval for use of those drugs and vaccines in people, it's been astonishingly quick. There was a member reading one audit that says it's about 600 days on average in the past from getting funding for a phase 3 trial to enrolling the first patients. In the recovery trial, for instance, we enrolled the first patient 9 days after we first drafted the protocol. And we had the vaccines in use within a year. And we had the first treatment for COVID-19, dexamethasone, in June 2021, within 100 days of starting the trial. Absolutely phenomenal. We've now evaluated 11 drugs, and we have 9 results, conclusive results from the recovery trial. And there are other good trials. So you've got to ask yourself a question: why can't we do this every day? Why does it take a pandemic? Why does it take so long to develop vaccines and get them licensed? Why does it take so long to develop drugs and get them licensed? Not just for infectious diseases like COVID, but for cancer, for heart disease, for respiratory disease. What is the system doing that we've changed so that we've made such a massive difference? And not return to business as usual. Already I can see people returning to business as usual in terms of slower ethics approval, slower regulatory approval, less inclination to do research, and more more sites declining to be enrolled. So I think for me that's the real question, and we have to be realistic here. We've heard some positives said, and there have been amazing achievements, but we mustn't forget also that there's been huge waste. There have been a lot of uninformative trials, and a lot of I think wasted resources. And so I think it's really important that we look very critically at what's worked and what hasn't worked. And for me, the big lessons are there are huge barriers now to doing good clinical studies. There are big regulatory barriers. The costs of trials have escalated. The level of regulation has escalated. It's really a massive disincentive to improving care. If you can do trials quicker and cheaper, as long as they're safe and ethical, then everybody benefits. The average cost one estimate of the average cost per patient in phase 3 trials is $50,000. The trial we ran was $500 per patient. Why is the cost $50,000 per patient? What's happening there? So I think we have to look at the regulatory framework, and also the way that contract research organisations are in many ways overcomplicating trials and making them very expensive. So I think we've now seen what's possible. We now need to make that the regular way that we do clinical research, because we will all benefit. It will be more cost effective, and we will have better treatments faster, and we will stop using ineffective treatments in a faster time frame. I'll stop there and happy to discuss more about those issues.
And indeed, Sir Peter, I often work with rare disease patients, and they're certainly looking at what has happened in the last 2 years to say, if that's what's possible, that kind of speed and focus and capacity to test out new things and try new things, why can't we do that for rare diseases? So as you say, I think one of the key lessons we need to take is, where is the waste in the system? Where's the inefficiency? And how do we cut all of that out so we have the same laser sharp focus in other areas of health? Let me bring in Enrique Suarez, because we also want to understand how you go from some of the things that Peter talked about in terms of knowledge and testing and trials into products that can be used, vials that get out into the field. What does it take to manufacture something completely new at an unprecedented speed? Because it's not like you can just press a button and up pops a new factory that creates it. This stuff is complicated and has to be done at high quality because of safety issues. So give us an insight from your perspective.
Absolutely. And firstly, it's an honor to be with this panel. And also, I'm very fortunate to go last because I can build on many of the brilliant statements that my colleagues have shared. From AstraZeneca's perspective, and going back to your initial question, are we ready? Have we learned enough? I think this is going to be a learning process for all of us. And why do I say that? Well, it gets a little bit to what Sir Peter had mentioned, which is the time to take action. If I can just build on that conversation regarding AstraZeneca and the University of Oxford, for the development of our vaccine, which I think is important because we did something different, at no profit, was the most visible aspect of our commitment as an organization during the crisis. That means that we as a pharmaceutical company were operating completely different. The partnership was negotiated in 10 days. Not often does this transpire, but in 10 days, why? Because there was an urgent need to address this COVID-19 emergency. The Oxford team recognized that this partnership with AstraZeneca was going to accelerate global clinical development and is going to afford us the ability, leveraging our skills, to scale up manufacturing and crucially ensure broad and equitable access all around the world, which gets to the point on ensuring all countries had access to our product. Having established manufacturing capacity in 15 countries, it allowed us to offer more. And we used 25 different manufacturing sites, which gets to your point, to supply vaccine to every region of the world, but that still requires significant testing and assurance to make sure that product is just as high quality as any other product AstraZeneca would put into the market. And we are ensuring that these facilities were working around the clock and to the highest standards necessary to meet the demand. Today, I'm so happy to say that we've been able to supply 2 million doses of our vaccines to over 170 countries. If you asked us this 2 years ago, I don't know if we could say, yes, that's going to be possible. But this is an extraordinary feat of working across multiple stakeholders to make this a reality. And I want to echo something that Nikolai had also mentioned around public money, because I think this is one of the greatest examples we will ever have in history on the need, the symbiotic relationship between public and private partnerships. And I think this is an excellent way of showing what is possible when we all come together with one purpose: to put an end to a pandemic, which unfortunately we haven't yet done, but to provide a solution to a pandemic that we didn't see viable 2 years ago. Our commitment here at AstraZeneca is to keep providing broad and equitable access to our COVID-19 vaccine. AstraZeneca was also the first and remains the largest supplier of vaccines for the COVAX facility to support low and middle income countries and to help them emerge from this crisis. So regardless of the COVAX supply, almost 2/3 of our total vaccine doses have been delivered to these low and lower middle income countries, which again highlights the need to make sure that no country is receiving preference over the other. And we're doing our part to get these vaccines out to the individuals who need it. So in conclusion, my point is that we need to respect and understand the complexity of manufacturing a vaccine that can take up to 5 months to get from start to finish. But we're here at a great moment to celebrate how far we've come and also to challenge ourselves on how much further we need to go.
Thank you very much, Rick. And let me remind the people who are watching us on the EU40's platform, you can submit questions to our panel. Please feel free to do that. You use the Q&A function that you'll find on the right-hand side of your screen with the menu. Let me focus in again a little bit more on this issue of partnerships. And I'll come back to you, Peter, because what do you think is the critical role of the international public-private partnerships in both access, but I think here also technology transfer? Because we are right, the world's, having gone from zero 2 years ago to now having a number of different vaccines rolling out, as Rick has said, billions of doses. But we're also on the edge of increasing capacity. And for example, Africa, it's a game changer to have, more capacity on the continent to manufacture medical supplies. So it's this tech transfer. It's not just IP, but it's tech transfer and now know-how that could have a huge impact on overall healthcare sustainability globally. So what would you like to add on that?
Yeah, and I think Rick meant to say 2 billion, not 2 million doses. Yeah, I think the pandemic has really shown that academic excellence partnered with industry know-how and industry scalability has been transformative on the vaccine side, but also on the therapeutic side. Many of the drugs that are being evaluated, started in academia and then went through small biotech and bought up by big biotech. Many of the trials, like REMAP-CAP and Recovery, have partnered with industry to have an academic sponsored trial with the drug being supplied by the company. And we just heard about the very successful Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. And so it seems to me that it's the perfect model. And it's particularly useful for pandemic infections because, we need to be frank that many of the pandemic threats do not present a good business case for industry. If you look at the WHO list of priority pathogens, you've got infections like Ebola, Lassa fever, where it's hard to see that there would be a commercial aspect to that. So what you can have is a partnership where there's investment in academia that can do the basic R&D to get to a stage where we have products. And under that, I would include diagnostic tests, drugs and vaccines that are at a stage where they could be produced at scale and on a commercial basis if the need arose. And that's precisely what happened with the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. It was based on a MERS coronavirus vaccine that was developed, as an academic R&D activity, but was at a stage where we had the understanding of the platform, so it could be modified for SARS-CoV-2. We understood the safety profile, and we had enough data from phase 1 trials and manufacturing at scale for trial use that we could shift quickly to doing the necessary trials and then work with an industrial partner to make sure that it became a usable product. So I think it's a perfect example of how this can work, and what it requires really, from my side as an academic, is investment in academic R&D, but also incentivizing a link with both industry but also public health actors to take products to scale in a way that is accessible and affordable to those who most need it.
Thank you. Rick, if I could invite you to tell us a little bit more about these international partnerships. You mentioned 25 sites in 15 countries, the ability to run production at the same level of quality 24 hours a day. This is a potential capacity for future healthcare that's quite extraordinary. Can you tell us a little bit more about how much the role of public-private connections can happen there? Maybe the role of public authorities in de-risking some of these investments, in setting up quality assurance, in paving the way for simple things like customs and logistics to work better. How does you see from a commercial perspective the role of the public sector in facilitating exactly what you've just done? I think we need to unmute.
My apologies. Thank you.
Go ahead. Great.
I think we have to begin with, in a way, forgetting how we've always operationalized and find new ways to show our flexibility and our ability to scale. I think Sir Peter had mentioned very quickly that, what we had to offer was that as a manufacturing expertise and supply chain experts, we also have engineers, technical scientists, and quality professionals in parallel working with our clinical development teams to rapidly apply innovative thinking to how we're going to get this vaccine out the door. And though we started manufacturing the vaccine at risk here at AstraZeneca, should the clinical trials prove successful or not, we had to go ahead and take action because there was such a demand. Now with that, we had to build more than 12 regional supply chains, as I had mentioned, to provide rapid access to the vaccine to as many countries as possible. And that is a big learning because that is what's going to facilitate more countries getting access to the product. We leveraged our own manufacturing expertise and capabilities and collaborated, as I said, with 25 partners. But let me give you an example of what that feels like. We used augmented reality headsets, enabling our teams to guide 25 partners in every corner of the world through this complicated process of making vaccines we have seen during making vaccines as we've seen during the pandemic. And export restrictions can have a negative and immediate impact on us. So we had to work hand in hand with quality assurance experts, the governments, to ensure that the product can get out the door and to the hands of the government. And I think one great example is the work that I've been fortunate enough to be part of here in Spain. I've worked with a government that I would say we've been connected at the hip day after day to ensure that when that vaccine comes in, that the regulations that prevent or afford medicine to be distributed in a country were already thought through so that we can quickly ensure that product was put into the autonomous communities. That required daily conversations with the authorities and a strong partnership on when the supply was coming in, the quality assurance that has been done, and how we can ensure that that supply is then sent into the autonomous communities and then into the I would say the vaccine events throughout the country. Public as well as private partnerships go far beyond just what we've discussed in access and technology transfer, but it has to be part of healthcare sustainability that we as an industry are supporting our government at every turn. And that is that we have to be, as we like to say in Spanish, un socio de valor, a partner of value, so that we can overcome many of the obstacles that we saw through COVID and what we're going to see in the future.
Thank you, Rick. Let me now come back to some of the elements that Nikolai raised in the beginning, where he said, that you fought to get more money at EU level for health, and we've just heard from both Sir Peter and from Rick that where public authorities can have a role. And let's talk a little bit about this issue about investment in basic research, because in theory, the OECD countries are supposed to invest 3% of their GDP in R&D. And in Europe, we don't get there. We haven't hit 3% yet. We're somewhere around 2%. And, I can see Sir Peter nodding. One of the things we clearly have learned from this is the important value in having the skills and capacity in our universities and our academic sector that is able to ramp up and to deliver on capacity. So when you spoke in the Parliament and you negotiated some more of this money, to what extent do you think there is a new political understanding about the value of investing in basic research, and how do you see this being translated into capacity to move forward? Nikolai.
I can only speak basically in relation to what I do, to the European Union, to our efforts on the budget. And I will tell you right away that unfortunately, ministers and those who contribute to the budget of the European Union, they tend to see very little beyond the numbers. They like to be conservative, not to pay so much, get as much as possible back into their member states. But beyond that realistic and perhaps depressing view, we have to say that the European Union is doing a lot these days. And thanks to the pandemic, science has become sexy again. I'm saying that because it has been brought to the front again as a political subject, as something that is highly, highly important. Do nod or say anything if you hear me well, because for a moment my image froze. You confirm?
Yeah. Yes, I can confirm.
Thank you. So I'm very happy that science is now back at the forefront, that science has become, again, something that everyone talks about, that all these companies are famous the world through, that a company called BioNTech in a small city in Germany finally posted revenues and profits that it hadn't seen in years. So all these developments are good. Are excellent. I hope my 2-year-old daughter will look at the world she was born in and aim to be a scientist, a researcher, a doctor, something along these lines, because these are the future jobs that we need. Now, coming back to your question, how does the public sector actually help with this? Well, we invest a lot in Horizon. I think nobody can claim that Horizon is underfunded or that there's not enough ambition to do that. Under Horizon, the cluster health has received the healthy doses of support and money. Just yesterday, I was looking at the numbers. We obtained 60 million more just for cluster health on the Horizon, and about 120, I think, in total, if I'm not mistaken. But the overall budget is in the hundreds, is I think around 100 billion, if I'm not mistaken. Somebody can quickly correct me if I am. But the problem with that is not the overall budget, but is the reach. We would like Horizon to reach more areas, more research centers across Europe. We would like to see more cooperation between these research centers. We would like to see a more Europe-wide development of knowledge centers. You have heard the presentation before, right after me, on also the effects on cancer. We are working very much on the Beating Cancer Plan to see these European centers of excellence, the network, the reference networks, etc. So all these things will create a market, I think, a stronger European market for research and for development, because we do need to catch up. You were right when you said that our research budgets don't match the 3%. They don't match also the ambitions that other countries around the world have on research. And I don't think Europe should be lagging at all, but it should really be a champion on this. One last word. Perhaps also student mobility is very important in this. I know it's not really directly connected, but the fact that last time we obtained 10,000 extra scholarships for Erasmus is also a good step in the right direction, because let's keep reminding people, because EU40 is an organization that represents also young politicians. The youth has been very much affected by this pandemic. They haven't traveled. They are more stuck to their own places, to their own centers. There's less interaction with the overall world. There's fewer international connections, and that's all a shame. Science cannot have borders. Science needs to be free. Science needs to travel.
Thank you. And just referring to your opening remarks when you talked about the impact, particularly on mental health for young people, it may be of interest to our audience to know that the OECD published earlier this year in the summer a report on the impact of COVID on health systems, and they particularly highlighted the impact of mental health of young people. So that might be worth exploring. And also we've had someone submit a comment in the chat to say that their organization, which is thinkyoung.eu, has carried out research and an online consultation of views of young people on the issue of vaccination. So both potential sources of information for you. Let me bring Antonella back in, because one of the things I think that the pandemic did very sharply was show us the impact of inequalities. And it shows how inequalities in society, whether it's access to green space, decent housing, replacement income, so you don't have to work if you're ill, how that made an impact on overall survivability of COVID. But this is something that's very clear and very stark also in cancer. And we already see that there's enormous differences in overall survival rate within countries and across the EU. So having had this lens of the pandemic, which showed us just how harmful our inequalities are, what do you think the EU could do to address inequalities in cancer, where we've got these big gaps in survival?
Okay, well, I work for the European Cancer Patient Coalition, and being this the largest cancer patient umbrella organization in Europe, for us, addressing inequalities across Europe is our priority. So, Tamsin, you rightly said that the pandemic has shown even more the existence of these inequalities, and not only between countries, but also within the same country, between regions. So these inequalities are due to the accessibility of healthcare facilities, treatments, healthcare providers, but they are also due to health literacy and the lack of awareness. So we, as a patient organization, have an important role to play here. With raising awareness campaigns, trainings, the development of educational, and of course, all this must be accessible in terms of language, key message to everyone, in the more disadvantaged. European level, well, notably, we have a lot of hope into the Europe's Beating Cancer plan as a fundamental to reduce, if not eliminate, inequalities across Europe. Also providing a framework of policy and incentives for their implementation across Europe. So one important point of the cancer plan is around coordinated among and within member states. It will mobilize financial instruments to support member states and enable the sharing of expertise and resources across the EU by supporting countries, regions, and cities with less knowledge and capacity. So, helpful and vital to ensure the efficient implementation of Europe's with accessibility data and up to registries in each country. hospitals will be able to tap into a wealth of information, ensuring that patients across the EU can get the treatment. We also believe that Europe is a bit in not to remain a nice piece of work. It is fundamental to establish a dashboard or a cockpit.
Antonella, I apologize. We're having difficulty with your connection. We're having difficulty hearing because I think your connection is cutting out a little bit. So could you just wrap up what you're saying and see if we can hear that?
Just I want to finish to say that the plan foresees the implementation of the inequalities registry, but this is for us only just one of the fundamental indicators to measure. There are more indicators to measure across the beating cancer plan to make sure that it is implemented properly.
Thank you, Antonella, and I apologize if the technology didn't allow us to get the full content of what you were saying. We're coming in the last 5 minutes or so of this panel, and I'd like to ask both Sir Peter and Rick to share some messages, because the next panel is going to be looking at how we take the lessons learned and put them into policy change. So if both of you, if I could ask you, what would be your wish? What would you like to say to policymakers? Because this is a platform where we've got young MEPs and others listening. So Peter, you talked about, lots of waste and inefficiencies. We've tied ourselves up in so many rules that it's expensive and heavy and slow to do this stuff. And yet we've just seen that it is possible to do it faster, cheaper, more efficiently. So what would you like to see change? And then Rick, I'll come to you.
So first of all, I'd like to see more investment in, R&D for global health threats on a longer time frame. I was involved in SARS-1, and the investment after that dwindled very fast. I was involved in bird flu. The investment in that dwindled very fast. Now, it may not dwindle so fast after this, but it shouldn't dwindle at all. We need sustained investment in R&D for global health threats at a scale that is meaningful. And when politicians are thinking about what kind of scale of funding they should put into this, think of the scale of the costs every day to your countries during the pandemic. And think of the economic benefits of reducing pressure on the healthcare system, saving lives, reopening economies. It's in the multi-billions. And that's the metrics against which we should be thinking about investment in public benefits to prevent pandemic threats. Secondly, you've got to simplify your regulations. I'm afraid the EU is not famous for its simplification of regulations. And we've seen what's possible. And I think if the regulations go back and the way things are done go back to the old business of usual, then people will point fingers and say, people will be dying because we're spending 5-10 years to develop drugs when we know we can do it in 1 or 2 years.
Thank you very much, Sir Peter. So simplify and invest over the long term at a meaningful scale. Don't be like a butterfly and move off to the next thing when you think this threat is gone. And I think the point you made earlier about how a lot of the investment that happened in the platform, so that when a new pathogen came along, the platform could be adopted and adapted and used. So it's careful drip of support for the basic research that can then be capitalized on. Rick, let me turn to you. What would be the messages you'd like to give to the next panel about the policy changes that they need to put in place?
Absolutely. First, I want to build on something Antonella said, because I think what Antonella was leading us down the path of the importance of early diagnosis and detection in cancer care as well as chronic diseases. And if we do this, we are reducing healthcare system inefficiencies and the stress in the system, which is one of our greatest learnings through this pandemic. How do we eliminate healthcare inefficiencies and stress in the system? And that's where I believe that policy has to be designed to look at investments in technology and technology infrastructure throughout Europe. we have so much that we can do with data, but oftentimes we look at data and infrastructure and technology as a cost. We need to look at this as an investment. And that type of investment will help us reduce healthcare inefficiencies and stress in the system. So that would be the first point. The second point is we have to take a look at what else we can do as it relates to hospitalization and reducing hospitalizations. We cannot forget what you said from the beginning of this call, 250 million impacted by COVID. Think about the stress on the hospitals, 5 million deceased, and 3 million cases continuing to be at the forefront of our discussion and the pandemic today. More work has to be done to support the health system and hospitals to ensure that they have the right infrastructures, the right policies, and eliminate whatever bureaucracy is in place that would prevent them from doing the best that they can to serve patients.
Thank you very much, Rick. Some clear messages there for our policymakers to think about and reflect on. Partly it's to do with the attention and the, being consistent and making sure that we've got the investment in the research capacity and knowledge. It's also partly at looking at the way that we develop layer upon layer of bureaucracy for decision making, each of which may have been put in with the best of intentions, but it ends up making it expensive and slow and difficult to develop a trial. And we can see that this is slowing down access to innovation and new treatments, which is important for whether it's for cancer, it's for rare diseases and others. We need to progress faster on our medical innovation process. And I think we've just seen in the last 2 years what it looks like when you speed things up. And I think this should be the new business as normal that we should be focused on, rather than a return to the past, which hasn't delivered the kinds of changes that we need. So I'd like to say a warm thank you on behalf of the audience to the members of this panel, to Nikolai, to Antonella, to Sir Peter, and to Rick. Yes, Nikolai, go ahead.
I just want to say that myself as a policymaker, I listen very attentively to my fellow co-panelists, and I take to heart what Sir Peter Horby said. The investments dwindle very fast after epidemics. I, for one, shan't forget, and I think we shouldn't forget too quickly what happened and what the good lessons were and the bad lessons were. Indeed, politicians elected with a very fixed term tend to forget what everything that's beyond 4 years or 2 years or 5 years is. But we would fool ourselves if we put ourselves in this position again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nikolai, and thank you again for participating in this panel. We're going to take a short 5-minute break, and when we come back, we will be discussing on the next panel. We're going to explore how do we translate the lessons that we just heard from this panel into effective policy change. Thank you very much, and see you in a few minutes. Hello and welcome back. We're now going to have a new panel that's going to explore how we translate the lessons learned from the previous panel into effective policy change. And I'm going to have 4 members of my panel who will be helping me to explore what we do next and where we go. So joining me will be Tomislav Sokol, a member of the European Parliament from the EPP group from Croatia, Stefan Schreck, the advisor for stakeholder relations at the European Commission's Department for Health and Food Safety, DG Sante. I'll have Sibilia Quilici, the Executive Director of Vaccines Europe, the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations, EFPIA, and Ellen Hoog, the Senior Policy Manager for the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovations at CEPI. And they'll each be answering some of my questions. And as with the previous panel, you, the audience, can also submit questions using the Q&A function that you'll find on the right-hand side of your screen. And again, a reminder, if you're on Twitter, to use the hashtag EU40Talks. So let me start by, and perhaps I'll bring in Ellen as my first person in this conversation. The pandemic showed us the weakness in our global surveillance and both the power of sharing accurate, comparable data. Now, the EU's got very ambitious plans for the European health data space. How does this fit into the global picture of early intelligence about future pandemics and coordinating a global response?
Thank you very much. And then first and foremost, thank you for including CEPI in this distinguished panel. I've been enjoying the conversation so far. And absolutely, this is very important work. Strengthening global surveillance networks, early warning systems, and data sharing will definitely be of key importance in a future pandemic preparedness ecosystem. So specifically, this will inform preparedness and also impact our ability to react fast. And time is of essence in every epidemic response as the growth is exponential. And building on the technological innovations that we heard about also in the first panel, that is now available. And by further increasing global collaboration, CEPI believes that we could and should aspire to reducing development timelines even further than what we've seen in this pandemic. We've set an aspirational goal of 100 days, and informed by improved surveillance, our plan includes building libraries of vaccines and other biological countermeasures and further evolve platform technology to mitigate the risk of the 25 virus families we know infect humans so that we can stay one step ahead of future epidemics. Increased coordination and collaboration between regional, country, and global capacity will be necessary to allow for a more efficient and robust responses. Very few regions, let alone countries, are capable of being fully self-contained and moreover benefit from contributing to strengthen global resilience beyond our own borders, as no one is safe until everyone is safe. So strengthening global networks in broad will be key, and I want to take the opportunity to point out the very important role of the EU in strengthening global capacity in broad, also beyond the ambitions on data sharing and surveillance. Current activities include enabling clinical trial capacities through EDCTP, securing geographically distributed manufacturing capacity, like already raised in the previous panel, and the initiatives by Team Europe, and working to optimize supply chain issues like through the COVAX marketplace. And in addition to that, the importance of regulatory readiness have already been pointed to. And in this area, we do hope that the EU and the EMEA will take a lead role and also collaborate closely with, for example, the recently established African Medicines Agency. So yes, the ambitious plans of the EU will definitely be key also to a global strengthened approach.
Thank you. Let me bring in MEP Tomislav Sokol on this question, because we just heard before the break that one of the messages from Sir Peter Horby of the University of Oxford, he says that policymakers tend to have a short memory span. So when SARS-1 arrived, a lot of money went into research, and then when it disappeared, well, the money disappeared. Then we had MERS, again, more money put into research, and then it disappeared. And he called for sustained, patient, long-term investment to be able to have the kinds of capacities that Ellen has just spoken about. So that was one of the lessons he wanted to do. What do you think we need to do for the concrete policy changes to make sure the EU is better prepared for the next pandemic?
Thank you very, very much. Yes, definitely. Politicians have a very short span of attention, and only usually look at what is best for the next election. So this is something that definitely is a problem. So in order to address this, we need to create a concrete system, a concrete framework that includes also concrete institutional framework, so that we are better prepared for the next pandemic. What I wanted to say, so what the pandemic has shown us, that before EU started to act, nothing worked. So we had closed borders, we had lack of medical equipment, basic supplies in the country that needed it most. So when EU started to act, then things started to improve. So we initiated green lanes, then with COVID certificates facilitated free movement, and now of course also the joint procurement of vaccines, which enabled all the member states to get the vaccines more or less at the same time, so that everybody who wants to be vaccinated has a chance. So this shows us that EU can act. What is also important is, even though that healthcare is primarily your national competence, EU has concrete legislative and financial possibilities to act. But what is important is that we create a system which will be stable, and which will also contain concrete institutions with concrete mandate to act in the best possible way and to prepare for future pandemic. One of these institutions is HERA, which was announced, but it's not just HERA. HERA is just one example, one new, let's say, a new agency or a new entity with the main purpose of preparing EU for the next pandemic. So what do we need? So we need to create concrete stockpiles of strategic equipment. We need to create a system of early detection, and we have to have a regulatory framework to enact state of emergency when needed, which then also leads to other measures which are necessary to combat the future pandemic. What is also important, I would like to mention one concrete contribution from me in this sense, is that since I was the shadow rapporteur in the IMCO committee on the regulation of serious cross-border threats to health, we were able to include a new procedure for prior authorization for export restrictions for the member states, which means that if a member state wants to limit or prohibit export of critical medical equipment to other member states, it will not be able to do so without a prior approval from the European Commission. And of course, that if they want to get this prior approval, they need to justify for public health reasons why they are doing this. So we are creating a regulatory and systemic framework and financial framework which will make the European Union much better prepared for future pandemics. Of course, what we also need to do is to create much better civil protection. So this is something that has been completely neglected, not just in Europe, but I think in the whole Western world. So to have all general population prepared so that they can act by themselves in case of serious crisis, serious emergencies. This is something that we do not have at the moment. So we have to create again from scratch this system of massive civil protection where everybody will know what to do in case of an emergency. And of course, we have to create a landscape for investments into research, because our universities, if you look at world rankings, are much behind US universities, British universities, Chinese universities. So we need to create a very stable and strong and robust system of financing research, but also to create a general administrative framework so that bureaucracy and too much regulation does not act as an obstacle to innovation, which is also one of the very, very big problems in the EU. We know that we are much too bureaucratic than we should be. So these are some concrete proposals. Some of them have already been adopted by the Parliament. Now we're waiting for the Council what they will say. But I think that European Union will that this common approach, this common system, is something necessary, because if this crisis has shown us something, is that member states cannot resolve these big public health problems by themselves.
Thank you very much, Tomislav. And let me invite Sibilia Quilici from Vaccines Europe to add in on this, because the previous panel talked about the challenge of bureaucracy and the cost and how slow it does to get a new product into trials and moving it forward. And we just heard from Tomislav that this is an area where we need to do something. We've just got, and it's in the final moments of being approved, the new EU level HTA process. Is this the answer? Is this going to take away some of the hurdles and streamline it so that medical countermeasures and medicines, such as next generation vaccines or others, can be approved in a faster and better way, particularly in the context of a future pandemic?
Thank you. So with regards to HTA, I think it's important to recognize that an increased European HTA collaboration in clinical assessment would definitely speed up the patient's access. It would reduce the duplication of effort, allow for more efficient use of scarce human and financial resources in post-COVID era. And during the COVID pandemic, actually, and related to the vaccines development, it has actually clearly shown the benefit and demonstrated that it is possible. But beyond the vaccines and the pandemic itself, I think there is a lot of work to be done to make it efficient. The recognition, for instance, of the need for, we need to have flexible assessment methodology. There is need for acceptance of evidence packages generated for novel clinical trials, single arm trials versus basket trials, etc. The standards of care change at a lightning speed. I mean, on COVID-19 treatment, for example, we've seen what has happened, and there is really need for flexible acceptance of evidence evaluation methods. And we need also novel endpoints. So a lot of new way of actually thinking about those joint clinical assessments for HTA would be required. And also we need a pragmatic approach with regards to uncertainty, how we actually recognize that evidence uncertainty is something that needs to be handled rather than being punished. And we've seen it with COVID-19 vaccines, for instance, and it's going to be similar for COVID-19 treatments. We need to manage uncertainty. From an economic standpoint, we need flexible recognition of the social benefits in economic assessment. And more particularly, if we look at vaccines, for example, there is, I mean, it's no man's land, in fact, with regards to HTA dedicated to vaccines, because there is very limited HTA experience or HTA vaccines in several European countries. So a lot needs to be done to build actually joint clinical HTA assessment for vaccines. That requires strong expertise. You would need a European Vaccines Clinical HTA Committee dedicated to the vaccines, the assessment of vaccines, with all relevant experts. You would need the development of vaccine-specific methodologies and processes for clinical HTA assessment of vaccines. You would need a phased approach as well, because all of this needs to be actually addressed. So it will never, with the frame of the regulation, it has to come at a late phase. And more than anything else, you would need the industry engagement, because it's really important to work very, very closely with the industry in charge of the development of the product. So yes, it is part of the solutions, but it remains a tool. It remains a toolbox to ensure better allocation of resources in the healthcare system and to enable access to innovative treatments. But if we have issues really with regards to managing issues and uncertainty, it can still be better managed or addressed during the price and reimbursement debate, so later in the debate. But yes, part of what needs to be done to accelerate access.
Thank you very much, Sibylle. Let me invite Stefan Schreck in from the European Commission, because we've talked a little bit about, the role that public authorities need to play, and it's finding that right balance between, as Sibylle has just talked about, new HTA process means new committees and new things that need to be set up. If they're done right, they streamline the process. They make it easier for everyone. They make it clear. And at the beginning of our session, Nikolai talked about how extraordinary it was that a country like Romania could get access to this brand new vaccine at the same time as everyone else, and that it really acted as a sort of counterbalance to some of the inequalities we have. So we saw the absolute best of what can be done at EU level. But we've got to find this balance between making the response appropriate, putting in place the kinds of committees and structures that Sibylla talked about, to deliver on the HTA process, but not to drown it in bureaucracy. So I know that's a tough ask, but what changes do you think need to be put in place so that we are better prepared for the next set of health threats, that the lessons can be learned from the last 2 years?
Yes. So what we can see is that we really learn step by step. I mean, you refer to the joint procurement. I would like to recall in that respect that actually not even the first SARS event provided enough political momentum to already introduce then in 2004 or 2005 joint procurement as an option for member states and the EU level. Actually, it took the swine flu pandemic in 2009 to introduce this in European legislation. And now we have seen in the corona pandemic how useful it actually is. But it really took ultimately a decade, I would say, until the first proposals were made to its real application. And for HTA, actually also there, I think a key element is better collaboration among member states here. I should say that actually the HTA regulation actually comes after the marketing authorization process. So actually the marketing authorization process will stay the same, but actually then the evaluation of the medicines by the national systems could be done in a more harmonized way. And we hope a lot that it will both make it easier to have access for people in all the member states, or at least in most member states. So we make progress there. But also, indeed, in case of a pandemic, this collaboration, I mean, we had already in the joint action we are running there, EUNet HTA, the so-called rolling collaborative reviews for potential treatments for COVID-19. And this could be institutionalized if you so wish. But of course, it also means that new structures need to be set up. And then the question is ultimately how member states will use this. We know that, let's say, traditionally member states had different approaches to health technology assessment. And introducing this new approach offers a lot of advantages, but also means a challenge for national systems. So we are very hopeful that, first of all, we are very happy that this will hopefully be approved rather soon by the co-legislator. And then we will continue working with member states to actually fully implement it, both in pandemic conditions, but also, let's say, in normal life, if you so wish. And indeed, one of the key elements of the added value of this could be facilitating access by more Europeans than has been the case very often in the past.
Thank you. Sibylla, let's perhaps talk about some of the other instruments that we have sitting up at the EU table at the moment. So we have the EU pharmaceutical and industrial strategies, which together with the brand new HERA that's being set up are creating a sort of ecosystem that's designed to align more closely some of the R&D research, the life sciences environment with the kind of medical and health needs that we have, plus having a system that pump primes the early investments that are needed. So, can you give us a sense from your perspective how the last 2 years have changed the landscape for the life sciences industry? And are we now better prepared? Do we have more skills and capacity than we did 2 years ago?
We have tools. I think it's really important that we start implementing the learnings from the previous crisis. I think that's critical because even before COVID-19, I mean, we had crises. We had Ebola, Zika, H1N1. Just before COVID-19, we had a measles outbreak. Not seen as a pandemic per se, but it was still an outbreak that disrupted massively this vaccine industry, for instance, and created a lot of burden and death. So implementing the learning from the previous crisis with the tools that are today provided would be critical. From our opinion, it's really important that an EU holistic approach is being provided for the EU pharmaceutical strategy and the industrial strategy. But we should also not forget about the trade strategy and all of that in coherence with the other EU initiatives such as the Intellectual Property Action Plan. The EU industrial and pharmaceutical strategies are really key opportunities to drive Europe health and growth. And the steps that we believe Europe could really can take together is potentially to compete with other regions such as China and the US in the development of new medical technologies, bringing real innovation to meet the challenges faced by the patients and our health systems. But all of this really includes having a very strong IP framework, intellectual property framework that protects investment in medical research, and a regulatory framework that is stable, but in the same way flexible. And we've seen flexibilities as being key in times of crisis, fast, effective, and globally competitive. And in this context, the industry is really committed to work with all the stakeholders and the EU institutions to find the solutions for concerns raised by the appropriateness of the current intellectual property framework to attain the societal goal of reducing unmet needs while ensuring value for money. So IP framework is critical. The second point being also the regulatory framework. And the first point that I really want to stress is, as I already mentioned, is this critical need to include all the stakeholders around the table, all needed stakeholders around the table in an open and constructive dialogue. On our side, as the industry, we have knowledge. We carried out studies with independent consultants. We can provide reliable data, solutions, and know-how. And we have actually demonstrated during the pandemic that we were key stakeholders to work with in an open manner. And this has really as a for opportunity to bring solutions, innovative solutions to patients in an accessible manner, but also ensuring that we have a competitive industrial environment in Europe. And when we look at HERA more specifically, I think is while we went through COVID-19 pandemic, we were really in a reactive mode to the issues as they actually came, in a way of collaborating with our EU institutions. I mean, we created platforms for communications that were not present before. We had nearly day-to-day communication with the Commission, with the CDC, EMA, etc., which brought massive added value in getting the solutions moving forward. And the creation of HERA in that regard will be a first step to put Europe at the forefront in addressing the global health threats, leveraging what we managed to put in place in terms of solutions to tackle the issues. And a lot of points have been addressed with regards to joint procurement, stockpiling, and how this is going to work in the context of HERA, for instance. From our side, it's really important that HERA concentrates its effort on what needs to be tackled for pandemic potential, so that it's not going to compete with existing incentives that would actually be used for better results elsewhere. HERA's joint procurement facility would be really important. I mean, we've seen the value as well of the advanced purchase agreement from the COVID-19 for COVID-19 vaccines and treatment. Also, there are lots of lessons learned from those APAs, but it demonstrated the ability to ensure equity in access in times of crisis. So a clear process, but being restricted to medical countermeasures is really important because if I just take the example of vaccines, for example, you have as many procurement mechanism and recommendation as you have member states. So actually having joint procurement would be really for vaccines in non-pandemic situation would be very, very difficult. And with regards to stockpiling in the same way, it should be really limited to a number of critical products that are needed in response of public health emergency, not to disrupt actually the global supply chain for any other products potentially, or specific products that cannot be stockpiled over long term as well, because they have short-term shelf life, like vaccines, for example, or products that are very difficult to move around as well when you have a short or long manufacturing lead time. In that regard, if I take the example, and it was mentioned in the previous panel by my colleague from AstraZeneca, the COVID-19 vaccines is really specific in its ability with influenza vaccines to be produced in a fairly short period of time. It's 5 months, 6 months from beginning to end before being released. Other type of vaccines can take much longer, between 2 to 3 years to be produced. So from the beginning into the manufacturing site to the end that it is delivered to the citizens. And here is where actually stockpiling would be quite difficult, and ensuring the capacity of anticipating actually the complexity of vaccines manufacturing and the long manufacturing lead time would be really important thinking about stockpiling issues.
Great. Thank you very much. Let me bring in Ellen to get us a little bit of a global perspective here, because of course the pandemic has been a global experience, and even though Europe is once again the epicenter of new infections, other parts of the world have also suffered greatly on this. And as a result, there's been a clear call to improve and strengthen governance at global health level. And the EU is putting forward and supporting, through the President of the European Council, Charles Michel, is advocating strongly for a new pandemic treaty that would strengthen global health governance, improve information surveillance, and the ability of the WHO to coordinate actions. From your perspective in CEPI, where you clearly prepare for these kinds of things all the time, do you think this new global pandemic treaty would address some of the gaps that we saw during COVID-19?
So we now have the opportunity to transform the way that the world deals with pandemics for the benefit of all. And as been mentioned so many times now, we've seen both unprecedented speed of innovation as well as unprecedented level of international collaboration, both in the EU, but also globally through ACT-A and COVAX. But the stark reality is that the global inequity observed in this pandemic is unbearable. And it is only through setting the right level of global ambition that we can ensure that we do not repeat those mistakes of the past 18 months. So whether that is ensured by a treaty or other agreements, it is crucial that we now take the time to design a global system that is more fit for purpose. And the three main gaps that we have seen in this pandemic that we now need to cover is that we need to strengthen the political leadership and the governance with clear roles and responsibilities to cover for and address the vacuum in global coordination that we've seen. We do need to build, as mentioned, a system of predictable and sustainable financing, both for the inter-epidemic periods, but also for outbreaks. And building on the technological platforms that we've seen, R&D and scientific innovation, manufacturing innovation included, to take down, lead times, etc., are key elements of the preparedness picture. So, if properly funded, we can transform that approach. Moreover, at the same time as funding for preparedness, we do need that ready releasable surge funding to cover for the necessary response elements, also in R&D, like at-risk manufacturing, also mentioned earlier in this panel. And last but not least, the part around equitable access and making sure that that is really put at the core of both future governance as well as financing. As we've seen, pandemics do not respect borders, as you just said, and it's neither the fairest, nor the fastest, nor the most cost-effective way to tackle pandemics the way that we've dealt with them now. So, whilst it is a legitimate need of every country and region to protect its own population, this also happens through making sure that we have a more equitable access in a global setting. So it is our hope that the EU will play an important role in making sure that this happens and driving equitable access, for example, by linking R&D investments as well as procurement agreements to equitable access measures. So if governance, financing, and coordination is well done, we believe in a world where a pandemic is no longer a threat to humanity. We have the technological tools, and this is now a question of political will and leadership more than science.
Thank you, Ellen. Let me bring back Stefan and invite you to pick up on something we discussed in the earlier panel, where we heard about the impact of COVID-19 on cancer patients, that routine care for many chronic conditions was delayed or cancelled, and we've got this enormous backlog now of patients that need care. We've heard how under COVID-19 there was the ability to move quickly, to be flexible, to up the capacity and to respond differently. What lessons do you see us taking from the pandemic response that we could use to address the burden of chronic care that still needs to be dealt with?
Well, I would simply say one thing which can easily be taken over is the better ability to collaborate at European level. Even though obviously it's really a very different situation which we have with cancer, it is also a disease which doesn't respect borders. Member states have very comparable situation and very comparable challenges. And there's also the question of equitable access to the solutions which are around. And we believe that also in the area of cancer, we can help everybody if there's a better collaboration among member states. Now, again, of course, we have to take into account the particular role the European Union has in the area of health care, which is essentially just to add value to what member states can do on their own. But we think that actually, indeed, there is a lot which can be done at EU level. And for example, the exchange of expertise. That is something member states, the different health systems provide a test bed for all sorts of approaches in care for cancer patients. And the best ones are identified and then exported to other European member states. For example, the idea of comprehensive cancer centers or the European reference networks for rare cancers. Or in the future, we will also like to establish joint training, interdisciplinary training for cancer specialists. Also, the exchange of expertise by telemedicine. And so there are many elements that basically build on the experience which we have in the pandemic, which ultimately are all about better and more intensive and IT-supported cooperation among the specialists in member states.
Thank you, Stefan. And I'll come to Tomislav for our final input on this panel. We had a comment that came in from the earlier panel. I think I'm going to bring it to you, which is they said, do we believe that we should change the health responsibility and move it from member state to European level? We've just been discussing the added value of this. And let me ask you, a politician who has to go back to their voters, do you think people are prepared to accept the kind of inequalities that we had before the pandemic, where in some countries you don't have access to treatments for rare diseases or others, and yet it may be available in the country next door, when we've just seen what happens at European level, when we can get equitable access, when countries come together and pool their resources and their efforts? Is now the time to say that health is better dealt with at European level?
That's a $1 million question. But first, I would like to say that the problem with EU health policy, that up until this point, up until the Europe's beating cancer plan and the pandemic, we didn't have one. And usually the lack of powers or this division of competences, whereby healthcare is primarily a national competence, was used as an excuse for the lack of political will to do something. So first, I do not think that treaty change, which would be necessary, is feasible, because nobody will go through the entire procedure of treaty change with ratification by all 27 member states just for one topic. So whenever a treaty change was made, it was a big change with which encompassed the new vision of the future development of the EU. And currently, we don't have a consensus on EU level on this future path of this future development of the EU. So it's not. So I do not see that a big overall treaty change is in the making, and there will be politically. It's not realistic that we will have treaty change just for one topic, that is healthcare. But still, I think that we already have enough powers, both regulatory and financial, to do a lot. We saw that. We saw with regulatory measures against export restrictions for stockpiling, joint procurement. We saw that we actually can do a lot when we want to, and the EU can provide help to the member states to resolve many of these issues. For instance, joint procurement. So currently, one of the big problems is that prices of medicines are very different in different member states. If we had one joint procurement, especially for expensive medicines for rare diseases, then these price differences would go away. And the European Union as a whole would have a better bargaining position towards the pharmaceutical industry to achieve lower prices. And this can be done. We already have the rules on public procurement. We already have the internal market legal basis, which can be used as the basis to adopt the rules on joint procurement, so this can be done. Also, when we speak of differences in terms of access, we have problems with differences in health infrastructure and lack of health workforce, lack of experts in some member states, especially the eastern ones. But we have a cohesion policy which can be used much better as an instrument to reduce these differences. One example, so we currently have EU for Health program, which is 5.3 billion euros, 12 times bigger than the previous health program in the previous budgetary period. But in the previous budgetary period, more than 25 billion euros were invested from EU cohesion policy into healthcare. So 5 times more than the EU for Health program, which shows us obviously that that we have a lot of potential to invest into health infrastructure, health workforce, but this has to be done in a much better and streamlined way with much clearer defined priorities. Of course, there are also other pieces of EU legislation that can be changed or can be adopted where we have competence which can make things better. For instance, the amendment of Cross-Border Healthcare Directive to make it easier for patients to access better healthcare abroad. The EU Health Data Space, the new regulation which should be prepared, which should make it easier, the exchange of data, which will make it possible to have much more cross-border clinical trials than before. And of course, the HTA regulation, which could have done, I have to really criticize the final outcome because I think that the HTA regulation, the final result, which is the result of compromises within the Council, will not create the effects that we want in terms of facilitating faster adoption of new technologies. So I think this is also something that will need to be addressed and amended in the years to come. But despite of that fact, I think that we have a lot of possibilities, both regulatory, both financial, that we have not used up until this point, or we have used them in a not the best of way, like the HTA regulation, but we can do much more within the competences that we already have to reduce these differences that exist in terms of access to healthcare. And we have to send a message that EU will not tolerate first and second class citizens. But we have the possibilities, we just have to act.
Thank you very much to Tomislav. And I'd like to say a warm thank you to the members of our panel, because we've come to the end of this conversation, to Stefan, to Tomislav, to Sibylla, and to Ellen for sharing your insights on how we translate the lessons from the pandemic into future policy change. Let me recap a couple of elements that I think we've learned from our two panels and our time together. I think there's been a consistent message from all of our participants and our panelists that we should not go back to business as usual. We have seen what can be achieved when we invest strategically and carefully, where we collaborate more closely and effectively between public and private and with civil society. We've seen how much bureaucracy is slowing down our system. We can be faster, we can be more flexible, and we can be more cost effective. We've seen it's possible, and we can do it while maintaining safety and ethical and privacy guidelines. We need to play a stronger role in global governance for health, and that's very clear. No one is safe until everyone is safe. And so the EU needs to step up and start playing a stronger role, either through a pandemic treaty or through strengthened WHO. But it's clear that we are part of a global vulnerability, and we need to be part of sharing information and capacity. We heard how important it is to understand and manage our logistics and our supply chains so that we understand where the bottlenecks are and how that can be addressed. We heard a lot about the importance of sustained investment in basic research, patient research that doesn't go where the political winds go. If there's a new disease, a threat that comes in, money's put on the table and then it disappears. Because what we need to build knowledge, to build the networks of experts and academic institutions working on an issue, is sustained horizons of funding. So there was a strong plea from our first panel to say, invest Invest significantly with meaningful amounts of money over a long enough period of time to receive the return on investment, which will then give you the transversal, horizontal stuff that can be used for other disease areas and other delivery mechanisms. We've heard that the ambitious plans that have been put in place for the HERA agency, the new European health data space, the new health technology assessment processes, there's lots of new things being added to the EU health landscape. How we make it work is going to be key. No duplication, no rivalry, clarity, transparency, cooperation, and the ability to plug in from the private sector, from the academic sector, from the NGO sector, even from local governments, all of them plugging into this system so we have a smooth and well-functioning public health process. These are all the lessons that we heard. I think the other key thing that is, and this is a personal comment, having worked on public health at EU level for 20 years, we have never had a better moment. We have the attention of the political leadership as never before, from heads of state who, from the beginning of the crisis, were meeting every few weeks. Health ministers had a video conference every week for the first few weeks, every day, of the first few weeks of the pandemic. We are both exposed to each other and understand more about each other's health systems than ever before. Now is the time to strengthen and build on that trust and those relationships that have been created so that the next phase of health at the European level can be delivered for better health outcomes for patients and also for populations around the world. I'd like to say a warm thank you to you for participating, and whether you watched it on the live stream on LinkedIn or YouTube, or whether you were registered and you participated on this platform. This is just one of the EU 40 talks, and there'll be other events that you'll be able to participate on in the future. We asked you at the beginning, did you think we were properly prepared for the next pandemic? Yes, no, or partly. And we got a strong message that we were partly prepared, but there's still a lot more to do. And I think if some of the things we've talked about today in terms of investment, attention, collaboration, streamlining, transparency, and global collaboration, if those elements can be concretized and built on, then I think we will be much better prepared for the future health threats that we know are coming. Thank you very much. I'm Tamsin Rose, the Senior Fellow for Health at Friends of Europe and the Africa Europe Foundation. Thank you for spending time with us today. See you again at the next EU 40 talks.